We probably all know the story of Rosa Parks, right? Everybody remembers that in 1955 she sat on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, was asked to get up and give her seat to a white man, and she said no. And she was arrested, and that sparked the civil rights movement. What we might not know is that that was not the first event in the rebellious life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, according to author Jean Theo Harris. Rosa Parks was a lifelong activist, and she was a deeply spiritual woman. She found solace and peace in church. When she was a child, Rosa was living with her mother and her father went north looking for work, and he never came back. So her mother moved Rosa into her grandparents' home. They lived there with her grandfather and her grandmother, and her grandfather was also an activist, and he was born a slave. He was the product, actually, of a sexual assault between a slave owner and a black female slave. So he was actually very light-skinned, and he would use that light skin sometimes to trick people into thinking that maybe he was white. But he understood the danger there was in being black, and Rosa said she remembered that often he would sit on the front porch of their home, and he would have his shotgun across his lap. He was ready to protect his family if he had to. He was always watching for any kind of danger. The windows on the inside of their home were boarded and nailed shut. And if there was anything going on in the neighborhood, Grandpa would have them all sleep in their clothing so that if they had to get up quick in the middle of the night and run, they would be ready. He was also very political and very outspoken, and whenever he saw injustice, he pointed it out to little Rosa. So she became very aware at a very young age of what injustice looked like, and she certainly knew what it felt like. When she was a little girl walking home from school one day, a white boy came by on the sidewalk on roller skates, and as he went by, he pushed her. And without missing a beat, Rosa pushed him. And he fell into the street, got angry, cried a little, and his mother threatened Rosa. Rosa said, "He pushed me, and I did not want to be pushed." Now, Rosa's grandmother scolded her for that. She said, "Don't you talk biggity to white folk." And Rosa's mother was afraid, because if this child was acting like this at this young of an age, she was going to get herself killed. Now, Rosa was fortunate enough to have some education. At this point in time, this is the early 20th century, for white children, they could go to school all the way through 12th grade, but public schools were only funded for black children up to 6th grade. So at 6th grade, unless a family could pay tuition, their children could not continue their education. So Rosa's mother worked extra, saved her money, and sent Rosa to a private school, which ironically was called Miss White's. Miss White was white, and so were all of her teachers, but all of her students were black, and they all paid to be there. But Rosa was an exceptional child. She was very bright, and she also wanted to help. So she would clean the classrooms and run errands for the teachers, and eventually began earning her own tuition. This little girl began to pay her way through school. In the 11th grade, though, she had to leave school. Her grandmother was sick. She had to return home to take care of her. She eventually finished her education, but not right away. Now, when she was 19, she met Raymond Parks. She didn't like him at first. He was also very light-skinned, and he was a barber, and he had his own car. But what really attracted her to him eventually was that he was an activist, and she could not say no to that. So she married Raymond Parks, and after their marriage, she began to work as the secretary of the NAACP branch in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, Rosa Parks was not only the secretary, but she was also something called the investigator. So if black women reported an assault, particularly by white men, Rosa Parks was the one who went to the victim's home, interviewed her, found out what happened, gathered evidence, and then took it all to the police department and asked them to put out a warrant for arrest. Now, she said, unfortunately, often the men who committed the crime would say, yeah, we did it. They didn't care because they knew they weren't going to be arrested, and even if they were, they would never be prosecuted, and they weren't. But Rosa just kept trying. She continued to try to bring people to justice and to take care of her people. So she was well known in the community as the NAACP secretary and the investigator, and even the police departments knew who she was. Now, the story about the bus actually starts 12 years before it did. When Rosa was only 30 years old, she boarded a bus, a public bus in Montgomery. Now, you know what segregated buses mean, right? The front rows are for the white people, and the back rows are for what they called the coloreds, right? They were in the back of the bus. And there was a middle section that could go either way. So if we had more white people than black passengers, the bus driver would get up and move a sign, and the sign showed where the white section ended and where the colored people could sit in the back. And as more white passengers got on, the bus driver would get up and move the sign back a few rows and make more room for the white passengers. The law was segregation, but some of the bus drivers liked to humiliate their black passengers a little bit more than the law called for. Some of them would have their passengers pay their fare at the front of the bus, and then if you were an African American, you had to get off the bus and walk around the outside and get on the back door, go in through the back. You were not even permitted to walk through the aisle where the white passengers were seated. And sometimes, if a driver was particularly upset or angry that day, while you were walking to the back door, the bus just drove away. So you had paid your fare and you didn't even get on. And if you paid your fare and you were sitting in your section and more white passengers got on and the black passengers had to move, if there was not enough room for you on the bus, you had to get off, even though you had paid your fare and you had a seat. So it really depended on the bus driver how the conduct on the bus was handled. And all the bus drivers were white, and all of them carried guns. And they let the passengers see the gun. They would posture so that you could see that they had a gun. And that's how they maintained order on their bus. So when Rosa's 30 years old, she boards a bus, and the driver is Blake is his last name, James Blake, notorious, known for being particularly cruel to passengers. She pays her fare, and he tells her to get off the bus and walk around to the back. But she sees that the aisle is clear. There's no one in the way. There's no one she's going to walk by. So she moves to walk past the driver, and he immediately jumps up and grabs her sleeve and tries to jerk her down the stairs. She collects herself, and she said, "I will get off. Don't you touch me." He backed off, made sure she could see his gun. She got off the bus, and she stood there. She wasn't going to get on the back door. She'd had enough. The driver drove off, and she walked home. She swore as that bus drove off that she would never ride with that driver again. But she did. 12 years later, she's now 42 years old. She's a little distracted, she said. Otherwise, she'd have never got on that man's bus again. But she did. She got on and paid her fare, got back off, walked around, sat down, and then realized she was back on that guy's bus again. Now, nothing happened for a while, but more and more white passengers were getting on the bus. And so eventually Blake got up and walked to where she was sitting and moved that white-only sign back a few rows and asked 4 African American people to get up out of their seats to make room for one white man. And nobody got up. So Blake showed his gun and said, "You need to stand up or I'm going to call the police." So with great reluctance, 3 of the other passengers got up, gave up their seat, went to stand in the back of the bus. But Rosa Parks just slid over and made room for the man. We don't know who this white man was. He was just standing watching all of this happen, and we don't even know his name. It's been lost to history. But Rosa was not going to get up. And Blake said to her, "Are you going to stand up?" And she said, "No." And he said, "I'm going to call the police and have you arrested." And she said, "You may do that." That was it. Now, there's a common story that Rosa Parks was so tired. Her feet were tired. She didn't want to stand up. None of that was true. She says herself, she wasn't tired. She was 42 years old. What she was tired of giving in. Now, in our reading today from 1 Peter, Peter is writing to a group of Christians who are just tired of giving in. They're tired of being excluded. They're tired of being picked on. They're tired of being harassed. And Peter is writing to encourage them. Now, this is Peter, the apostle, the fisherman, the one who spent time with Jesus as one of the 12 disciples. Scholars agree that this is that Peter, but the writing is way too nice. It's in Greek and it's really well put together. But scholars agree, for the most part, because it says it right in 1 Peter, that Peter had someone write for him. So he dictated or directed the letters, and a guy named Silvanus actually wrote these letters in Greek. Now, Peter is writing to these churches in Turkey. It's actually the area of Turkey. It's Asia Minor in the Bible, but now we know it's Turkey. So it's quite a bit north of Israel. And he's writing not to one church, but to a whole group of Christian communities. I don't even know if we can call them churches at this point in time. They are groups of Christians, and they are not Jewish. They are Gentiles. These are all areas where Paul had gone and planted churches everywhere he went through that area that's now Turkey. And Peter is writing to encourage them because he knows they're being persecuted. He knows they're being picked on. The Greeks and the Romans that live in that area, they despise any foreign religion. And so they are excluding this minority group of Christians. And Peter knows what that feels like. But this is the most amazing thing to me, that Peter is the one that tells them, do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse. There is a story in all 4 Gospels. When Jesus was arrested, somebody drew a sword and hacked a guy's ear off. Do y'all remember that story? There's one disciple that just said, no, you're not going to arrest Jesus, and cut this guy's ear off. And we find out in John's Gospel, it's Peter. Peter responds violently when they come to arrest Jesus, and he cuts this man's ear off, and Jesus tells him, put your sword away. And he went with no resistance when he was arrested. So Peter now, we see this change in him, don't we? From somebody who was kind of a hothead, somebody who was ready to fight to defend someone, to now being someone who's telling other people who are being excluded and discriminated against, he's telling them, don't be violent. You can resist, yeah, of course, but don't do it with violence. Pray for your enemies. Bless your enemies. And he knows that if we follow what Jesus said, we might have the same fate Jesus had, because Jesus was killed, and Peter would be too. So he tells them, we do this because we know it's right, even though it might cost us our lives. Now, Rosa Parks is sitting on that bus. Blake has gotten off to go get the police, and she realizes this might cost her her life. Other people have been arrested and killed. Her neighbor, actually, was arrested on a bus and did not survive. So she understands the cost. But what she said was, I just could not live with myself another day if I continued to cooperate with this unjust system. Couldn't do it. Now, while she's waiting for the police, there are other passengers on the bus that are getting off. Some folks are just, they don't want to wait around. They got places to go, and they're going to have to sit here now and wait for the police to come, so they get off the bus. Some know that nothing good's going to happen, so they get off the bus. But some stay. And out of those who stay on the bus, not one person said anything to Rosa Parks, not in her defense, and not to encourage her, not to say, we're going to pray for you, not to even touch her shoulder. She said she never felt so alone as she did sitting on that bus waiting for the police to come. It was as if everybody abandoned her. Now, the officers eventually get on board, and they ask her, why don't you just stand up? And she said, why do you keep pushing us around? And that makes me think of her on the sidewalk when the boy goes by on his roller skates and pushed her. It's been more than 30 years, and she is still being pushed. And she's tired. She's tired of giving in. The officer said, I don't know, but it's the law. They acted reluctant to arrest her, but they did, and she did not resist. She walked off the bus, and as she's walking to the police car, she overhears the words NAACP and an officer saying to Blake, are you sure you want to press charges? And Blake, of course, said yes. He did. But you see, the officers knew who Rosa Parks was. She had been investigating sexual assaults for 14 years. She had been at the police department. She had been asking for arrest warrants for perpetrators. And they knew she was well known in the community and a well-respected person in the community. Hardworking, Christian, modest, activist. She was fiery. She was not the sedate, quiet lady that we think she was. She was well-respected in all of the community, black and white. But Blake, of course, wanted her arrested. So he said yes. They took her to the jail, and once she was in her cell, she said, can I have a glass of water? And was told that the water was for whites only. How much can a person take, right? Now, Rosa doesn't know it, but there was someone on that bus that was watching and saw everything that happened and went straight to the NAACP, to the person who was in charge. E.D. Nixon was this man's name, and told him that she had been arrested. He gets together bail money and finds white allies, a white couple, to go with him to the police department because he was worried that he would pay the money for the bail and the police would take the money and say, they never got any money. So he had white people as witnesses. So we can be allies, friends. If we don't know what else to do, we can be an ally for someone who's being discriminated against. Rosa gets bailed out. And meanwhile, there is another black woman, Dr. Joanne Robinson. She's a professor, I think it's Alabama State College. She hears about Rosa Parks being arrested, and she's just had enough too. So during the night, she sneaks back into the college offices. She takes with her a couple students and a colleague, and they type up a paper calling for a one-day bus boycott in Montgomery the following Monday. I think Rosa was arrested maybe on a Thursday, so they're giving time for this to get organized. They're calling for a one-day boycott on Monday. And it doesn't say anything on this flyer about Rosa Parks. Her name's not on there at all. But it says simply that we support over 65% of the business on the buses, and we cannot put up with this kind of treatment any longer. So don't take the bus on Monday. Take a cab or walk. If you can't get to school, take a day off from school. It's okay for one day. Let's do this together. So Joanne Robinson runs off something like 50,000 copies of this flyer on one of those old mimeograph machines, if anybody remembers those, and maps out the city and gets volunteers to deliver these papers all over town. Now, Nixon, E.D. Nixon from the NAACP, he's pretty excited because he has been waiting for an opportunity to act. There were two other women in the same year, 1955, who were arrested on buses, but he didn't feel like it was the right person, it wasn't the right time, he couldn't use that to make a stand, but Rosa Parks, this was perfect. She was well known and well respected. Now, some suggest that the NAACP planned all of this. There is nothing in Rosa Parks' papers that were turned over for safekeeping after her death in 2005. There's nothing to suggest there was any kind of plot. She just was tired of giving in that day, and Nixon saw it as an opportunity. So when he found out that Joanne Robinson was calling for a boycott, they all joined forces. And the Sunday before the boycott, Nixon went to all of the black pastors, because we know the black churches were the backbone of their community. He wanted one of those pastors to be the face of the boycott. Now, all of these black pastors, they're not stupid, right? They know that if their face is the face of the boycott, their church is going to be the one that's bombed. Their daughters and their wives are going to be assaulted. Their kids are going to be heckled and hassled. And they're not willing to do it. But there's a new guy in town. The Dexter Avenue Baptist Church had an older pastor, and they didn't like him because he was too political. So they hired a new pastor, a young guy, fresh out of seminary with a young wife and a new baby. He's 26 years old, and his name is Martin Luther King Jr. I just love that they thought their old minister was too political. So all the pastors in Montgomery said, let the new guy do it. And King took one day to think about it and pray about it, and then said yes. Now, you might know now the rest of the story, right? Martin Luther King Jr. was the face not only of the bus boycott, but of the entire civil rights movement. And you may know that that bus boycott was a lot longer than one day. It was 381 days, I think. So it was over a year long. It was so well organized that the black churches and the NAACP bought a fleet of station wagons to act as buses for all the folks that needed to get places. You might not know that the taxi drivers in Montgomery got in trouble because they lowered all of their fares to the same as a bus ticket, and their business was booming that whole time. But what I'm sure we don't know is the price that Mrs. Rosa Parks paid for her part in all of this. Because when she was bailed out of jail, that was not the end for her. She went back to work, and no one at her workplace would speak to her. No one would be seen with her. They were afraid to be near her. And after 5 weeks, she was fired. Her husband Raymond was a barber, and barbers like to talk while they're cutting your hair, and he talked a lot about the bus boycott and about his wife's part in it. In fact, he talked so much, he also lost his job. Now they have no income, the two of them, no way to support themselves. Raymond falls into depression, and Rosa develops stomach ulcers. They look continually for work, and no one in Montgomery will hire them. The NAACP continues to send her out different places to speak and talk about the bus boycott and to generate donations for what was then called the Montgomery Improvement Association that King and others formed. But she never kept any of the donations. So she and Raymond got deeper and deeper in debt. And she didn't know what to do. She went to church one day, sat in the church and prayed. And she said she felt God answer her. She felt God say, this is all part of God's plan, and she was doing exactly what she was supposed to do. And now all she had to do was keep the faith. And that's what Peter is telling all of those Gentile Christians. It may get harder. The suffering might continue. But remember who you belong to and who you serve. And remember that we're standing up for what is right the same way that Jesus showed us how to. And Peter tried to encourage these folks in their suffering. I want you to imagine, as we close today, that you're on that bus with Rosa Parks, okay? You are on the bus. You are one of those witnesses. And I want you to imagine who you might be. Are you one of the white folks sitting in the very front? Maybe you don't even know what's going on and don't care. Maybe you're one of the white people and you had to go somewhere. So you got off the bus as soon as you knew that the police were coming and got another bus. Maybe you were sitting nearby Rosa Parks and you saw the whole thing and maybe your heart broke for her. Maybe you got off the bus because you knew there was going to be trouble and you had enough trouble in your life. Maybe you got off because you were afraid. Maybe you were too afraid to do anything. Maybe you were the police officer that came in and said, look, it's the law. I got to do this. It's the law. Maybe you would be the one person who would do something that nobody else did. Maybe you would just touch her shoulder. Maybe you would say, I'll be praying for you. Or maybe you'd say, I'll sit with you. Maybe you would say, they can arrest me too. I want you to take a moment and sit with that question. Imagine yourself on that bus. What would you do? Knowing what it will cost you, which is exactly what Peter is telling those Christians in our reading. You're on that bus. What will you do?